So much. Thank you everyone for having us today. My name is Gracia and I'm here with my colleague Annette, and we're both from GamCare. We work on the women's program specifically, and we work around raising awareness around gambling related harms and also the support services that are available. So we wanted to do a quick presentation for you today, specifically around women, and how gambling affects women and affected others, and also to show you what the support services are for women as well. And also to talk to you about how being in the armed forces relates to gambling. I think someone did mention it before about the links between the two, and we think it's really important to raise that awareness about it. Thanks, Annette.
Thanks, Gracia. Can you see the screen okay? Is that all okay?
Yes, I can. Can everyone else see the screen okay?
Yes, thanks.
Okay, great. I just want to let you know that we're actually going to be playing videos. So hopefully you could be able to share the sound. Sorry, I had to share the screen and then go back and share it because I forgot to share the sound. So we're just going to start with a case study, and it's a video from a lady called Kelly Field, who very kindly shares her story with us about gambling addiction.
Just thought, I can't imagine that I'd get up one day and I don't gamble. I couldn't see how it was possible. I started using online bingo sites, I think as a sort of way of escaping reality, and then moved over to the slots on the bingo sites, which I think was my downfall. And quickly, within 6 months, I'd racked up £10,500 on one credit card, which I then went on to get a further 5 credit cards, totaling over £30,000. Gambling is the be-all and end-all, and it is the most important thing in your life at the time, that you've got to be on there 24/7, you've got to be gambling, and you lose touch with reality, and the money's not money, it's just digits on a screen. I was suicidal. I used to think, I'll get in the car and I'll just drive into a tree, I'll just end it, because that you see that as the only way out. I'd gone to town one day and I put a £1,600 overdraft on one of our accounts, and I come home and spent that within an hour. So out of sheer frustration, anger, guilt, rage really, I snapped up the cash card to the account and I started scratching away at my wrists. It was superficial, it drew blood, which then sort of prompted me to go to the doctors then. My partner found an article in the local paper for a counselling trust, and I did a 12-week talking therapy, which I think was the start of help. I do just steer clear of gambling. So I do a lot of walking, which I think clears your head. I've adopted a little dog, so he sort of takes up a lot of my time, and I enjoy walking in with my friend.
So I've just stopped the video there because Kelly goes on to talk about the Northern Gambling Clinic, which actually isn't available to anybody down here in the southeast, but we will be telling you what help and support is available for anybody affected by gambling related harms. I must apologise for my voice. I've had a bit of a cold, so hopefully you'll be able to hear me okay. So what do we mean by gambling? Because gambling is very much part of our society now, and we have normalised gambling incredibly. So it's to stake or risk money or anything of value, and I think it's important to remember anything of value, because when we think about gambling, often we just think about money. But we often work with people within the criminal justice system who, whilst they're in prison, don't have access to money, etc. So they may use things like food or favours in a game of chance and in gambling within the prison system. And young people, for instance, often can use things like new trainers, etc. So anything of value on an outcome involving chance, we don't know what's going to happen. We hope we get the win, but we don't know. Problematic gambling is the gambling that compromises or disrupts, damages family, employment, personal and recreational pursuits. And problematic gambling and gambling related harms are massively impactive on the individual, but also on the affected other as well. And here at GamCare, we help everybody from the gambler or the person that might have disordered gambling problems through to those affected others as well. And what do we mean by gambling related harms? Well, that's the adverse impacts from gambling on basically on the community, on the mental well-being of individuals. We work very closely, Gracia and I, providing full training, and this is very much a snapshot of what we actually provide. Their free of charge training covers a lot of mental well-being, etc. And we work very closely with our colleagues within the NHS trust locally in the southeast, because they're seeing more and more people present with gambling related issues, whether they're the gambler themselves or they affected others. So gambling sits on a continuum, and as you can see, we've got 3 headings here. So social gambling, often if I could see you all now, which I can't when I present on Teams, but usually we would say to people, you know, who here gambles? Because a lot of us do, but we probably don't consider it maybe as a gambling activity. We take part in scratch cards, maybe the lottery, the 2p machines in the arcades down on the coast. You know, it's very entertaining, and within social parameters, it can actually be there can actually be a lot of enjoyment. You usually have spending limits, you know, if you're gambling with a friend, etc., or you go to horse racing, maybe somebody will say, you know, you were only going to bet £50, you're increasing that. So usually you have spending limits, and it's usually positive play. We know that people really enjoy gambling, and often they have those social cues from individuals that say, you know, actually, do you know what, that's probably enough now. When the problem increases, it's sitting underneath that moderate problem. People start what we call chasing losses. So they're losing money, so they're putting more money on to try and actually win it back. And what you have to remember is gambling is a behavioural addiction. It isn't a substance addiction where we can see physical changes very, very easily. With gambling, you can't see those. You cannot see those changes. You know, if you're dealing with somebody who perhaps is in addiction for alcohol or drugs, you can see them, you know, they'll have that physical stumbling about, perhaps their their pupils will be increased. But with gambling, it is a behavioural addiction, which is very hidden. So this can lead to overspending. People obviously don't have money to do it. Lots of people may feel that gambling could be an easy way out. And also a lot of preconceived ideas may be that gambling is all around having £100 and going to, you know, let's say the casino. It's not about that. It's about if you're spending £3, £5, it's too much money that could be used towards rent, you know, daily bills, children's lunches, etc. And often people in this pre-contemplative stage will understand that they've got a preoccupation with it. They know that there is some harm around it, but actually they don't quite know how to stop this. There is a change in your brain that happens when you start gambling. And anybody here on the call today, perhaps if you think about whether you've actually won when you've taken part in some sort of gambling activity and you felt that euphoria, there is a release of dopamine within the brain, which then becomes quite habitual and you become quite tolerant towards it. So if we start to look towards the severe problem, gambling, we know that this can be severe issues around debt. The fact that you can actually gamble online rather than having to take your money out and go into a bookies and place your bet has really changed the way that we gamble. If you've got access towards to a laptop or an iPhone or an iPad, you've basically got a casino in your room 24 hours a day. So obviously you can appreciate people are spending money and not really knowing they're spending it. As our first video showed you, you know, she was saying it's not real money, it's just like digits on a screen. Sadly, this leads to severe suicidal thoughts, suicidal ideation. And we do know that gambling has one of the highest suicide rates. There is a feeling that people are hopeless. They don't know where to turn. They lose their recovery capital incredibly quickly. So, you know, you're looking at people losing houses, cars, etc. Families, a huge family breakdown. People become incredibly preoccupied with gambling. When can I gamble? When can I get onto the screen again? You know, when can I do it again? And it is a real preoccupation, and that habit forming part of the brain has kicked in quite severely. And relationships are jeopardized. So we know that we've heard from women who have said, you know, I thought my partner was having an affair. They're always on their, you know, their laptop, or they're always on the phone. I can't see any of you on the screen now that I'm presenting. You may be sitting there with your phones. You know, you could be taking part in a gambling activity. We do know that we've spoken to women, and Gracia and I head up the lived experience work within the women's program at GamCare, who have said, you know, they gamble outside the school gates, but they wouldn't ever take a bottle of wine, you know, to the school gates, or drugs outside the school gates. You know, it is incredibly hidden. It's incredibly isolative for women as well. You can see on that continuum that it moves both ways, so we can go from the severe problem back to the moderate problem into social and complete abstinence if that's required. And at the bottom you can see the different tiers: brief intervention, extended interventions, and also structured treatment and what that looks like. And in our full training sessions we do a full program around what that actually looks like in regards to having those interventions. So gambling within the armed forces, as you can see on the screen, between 2 to 5% of serving RAF professional think gambling could be a problem for them. As you can see on the screen, in the UK alone, it's thought that members of the armed forces are 8 times more likely to develop gambling problems, especially if they've experienced past traumatic events. And we do know that that's a severe risk factor, people that have actually experienced past traumatic events. The risk that comes with gambling produces that feeling of high, and it can be really comforting and familiar to those service personnel. And obviously it's a way of escaping reality. And again, Kelly alluded to that on the video that we've just showed you. You know, it takes you out of yourself. You don't have to really think about what's going on. Often women will say it's a little bit of something for me, you know, when I'm leading such a busy life. And whether being in active service or retired, research shows that the armed forces are also more likely to suffer from financial death, substance abuse, mental health, as we've already heard about today from different presentations. Gambling can be used as a coping mechanism to deal with this. So we want you to look out for those sort of like indicators. And being part of an armed forces family presents unique challenges as well. And these can be around loneliness. And this is around the affected others, and those boundaries between work and personal lives becoming blurred. And we're going to talk more about affected others as we go through the presentation. Gracia.
Thank you very much, Annette. So quickly, I'm just going to talk through a few of the potential risk factors. And I think we've already touched on a lot of them during the other presentations, like that trauma, abuse and neglect is a big risk factor for a lot of people who do become addicted to gambling. Unfortunately, like Annette touched on before, they may use gambling as a coping mechanism, that form of escapism. And I think that's something that we do underestimate as well. We see that social isolation has played a massive impact, a massive part of people turning to gambling and using gambling firms to join a community. I don't know if you guys are aware of ads on daytime TV that will kind of lure people in, saying, come and join this fun community, have fun with friends online. And it's, you know, it's a really good way to draw people in. Specifically, we've seen that during the lockdown, a lot of people who have flocked to a lot of these gambling websites to kind of be part of something bigger than themselves, especially because they're locked in at home on their own, quite often not having people to socialize with. So we see that that's quite something that we see quite often as well. That low and high parental supervision is something we see quite often, and we have a young people's program who kind of looks at, like, works with young people, doing workshops with young people around gambling. And because we've had a massive increase in the amount of young people who are getting involved in gambling through games as well, gambling at school, and they're not really aware of the consequences of that. Also, early big win is a massive indicator. We worked with a women on a lived experience project that Annette and I do. We worked with a woman who won £5,000 on a £1 bet on the dogs betting, and from there she was absolutely hooked. She got that initial high and she was consistently just chasing that feeling, and unfortunately she got herself into massive amounts of debt. And it's really easy for people to fall into massive amounts of financial debt with gambling. And I think Annette, she talks about the online reels and how easy it is to rack up a crazy amount of debt in a really short space of time. And you'd be hard pushed to find someone who was abusing substances or taking alcohol, spending that amount of money in such a limited amount of time, and that not having any physical effect on their body. So I think that's something that with gambling you have to really bear in mind, that people can gamble for 48 hours at a time. People say they've gone 3-4 days without sleeping, just consistently gambling. You can imagine how much money they could be losing in that space of time. And then obviously we got things like using alcohol or drugs, and also socioeconomic vulnerability. And I think an article came out recently saying that It's really interesting that you see so many betting shops in deprived areas. You don't really see them as much in areas that are more affluent. And right next to those betting shops, you will see pawn shops. So people walk straight out of betting shops and straight into the pawn shop to sell something or pawn something to get more money to go back into those betting shops. And it really is something about selling that dream to people who are very vulnerable, economically vulnerable, and saying, if you win big, you can change your circumstances. So these are just some of the potential risk factors that we see come up time and time again. Thank you, Annette. In terms of gambling related harms, these are some of the impacts that people see. So in terms of resources, you see people who are taking out loans, going to loan sharks in their area. Unfortunately, that big amount of debt is one of the biggest harms that we see, and the ones that come out most is the debt, repossession, eviction. A lot of people who have been made homeless because of their gambling, and loads of people who are homeless already and trying to use the gambling as a coping mechanism or a way to make money to get them off the street. Unfortunately, you see people who resort to theft and fraud. We work a lot with the criminal justice system because a lot of people are in prison because they have resorted to criminal activity to fund their addiction, unfortunately. And what happens is when they go to prison, because they don't deal with the underlying issue, that issue still remains. And so when they come out, they end up in the same position because they still have that addiction. And a lot of gambling goes on in prisons. As Annette said, it's not only about money. People gamble using different things in prisons. They gamble with their dinners, they gamble with favors. So you do see that quite often. We also see relationships impacted, family breakdown, domestic abuse. We have loads of people, kids that say they don't go to school, they're truant from school because their parents haven't been able to pay the water bill. They haven't been able to have a hot shower in days, and they're really embarrassed, so they don't want to come to school. Unfortunately, in the first lockdown, we sat on 2 domestic homicide reviews where the perpetrator in question killed his entire family, and on both occasions the wives had gone to the council and said, I would like a separate accommodation from my husband because he's a problematic gambler, and once he gambles and loses money, he becomes really violent. So it is definitely something that we have to take into consideration and take very seriously. And we are working with Women's Aid at the moment as well to really raise awareness about the dangers of problematic gambling and the impacts that can have on a family. And then lastly, health, suicidal thoughts. The House of Lords did a report last year that mentioned that they attributed 1 completed suicide a day to gambling addiction. And so that makes gambling addiction, in terms of suicide, gambling addiction has the highest suicide rate out of all addictions. It surpasses drugs, it surpasses alcohol addiction. And so you can see how severe that can become. And we really think that is because there's not a lot of awareness about it. There's so much shame and stigma around gambling that people don't feel comfortable to disclose that they do have an addiction. And it's even harder for people who are in the armed forces, people who are homeless, people from certain marginalized communities where gambling is not permitted in their culture anyway. And so it's harder for people like that. They face additional barriers to getting that support. And unfortunately, it does result in people thinking the only way out for them is to complete suicide. And we really want to intervene before it gets to that stage. And we've got other things like anxiety, depression, self-harm, self-neglect, and physical health problems too. So we're going to play a quick video, and this is the last video we're going to play for you. And this just really shows what happens to affected others and their story, and we thought it's really important for us to highlight that as well, because quite often when we're talking about gambling addiction, we only think about the person with the problem, but we don't think about everybody else who is impacted around them. So we're going to watch this video and then we'll come back and just finish off.
Thanks, Gracia. And I just wanted to say before we play the video, it can be quite emotive. So if this has affected anybody, obviously, please feel free to step away from the session. And also, obviously, we will be passing our contact details on afterwards. So Gracia and I are more than happy to speak to you should there be any issues. Thank you.
My husband has a problem with gambling. I've given up trying to fix it. It's just what our life is now. Sometimes I feel like I'm stuck in a room and I can't get out.
My son gambles. I sometimes wonder if it's my fault. You know, was it something I did or maybe something I didn't do? It's affecting everything. Actually, I'm a bit embarrassed that it's got this bad.
My dad gambles. thought. He thinks I don't know about it, but I do. I've known something was going on for a while now. It's like I see my friends' parents and it's like a whole other world than mine. It's nothing special, it's just, I don't know, normal? I want normal.
My other kids don't say anything about it anymore, and it's not the kind of thing I discuss with friends. Everyone's got their own problems. I would like to think that my son could take control himself. No, it's not that simple. And gambling's everywhere you look these days.
I used to get my hopes up that things would change. I used to think we'd wake up one day and everything would be better. But I know it's not going to happen. I've thought about talking to Mum, but it's like, if I'm okay, then she's okay. But I know she's not. She's not okay.
The gambling makes life hard, but it's the loneliness that really gets to me. I don't want to talk to anyone else about it because I don't want anyone else to know. I know that he's hurting. I don't want to have to choose, but the kids have to be my number one priority.
So I've just stopped the video there because it goes on to talk about Australian support services, which we obviously can't access here. But just to give you a brief outline of the impacts on affected others, and this is on a citizens advice survey. For every disordered gambler, there are 8 to 10 affected others per gambler. So that's a huge amount of people, with 90% experiencing emotional distress. And obviously you can see those figures around mental well-being. 69% providing money to cover losses, because people just sometimes don't know that it's happening, but also want to support and help their loved ones. 33% of families struggling to afford food and rent, and really sadly, 33% of households with children experiencing family breakdown. So at GamCare, we offer free advice and support. So all of these support services are free of charge to individuals. We actually support and we run the National Gambling Helpline. That's open 365 days of the year, 24 hours a day. So if you remember anything from this very brief whistle-stop tour through a sort of gambling services, if you're thinking gambling, think GamCare and the National Gambling Helpline. That's your gateway into help and support. We also provide a web chat rather than a verbal support through the helpline. We have forums and chat rooms which are themed sometimes, and we have resources like posters, leaflets, etc., which can be accessible. We have a young people support service, which Gracia told you about. We've seen a quadruple in the amount of young people coming through with gaming and gambling issues. We also have a computerized CBT support service, which is done online, which means it can be done at that person's time. And this is help and support for the disordered gambler and the affected others. And we also have adult treatment services. So we have directly delivered GamCare services or partner treatment services, depending on which area of the country you are. GamCare covers all areas of the country. We're a national charity. When we do our full presentation and training, we work with different organisations and professionals to start talking about gambling. One of the biggest things that we know is that people don't talk about it enough. So we work with them around a template around what we call a starter question. So when they're doing assessments, when they're talking to individuals, let's start normalising gambling and gambling support to a certain degree. So it's a very straightforward question. Has your gambling or the gambling of someone close to you had a negative effect on your life? Or you can put it into the narrative that fits within your organisation. So what can you do in regards to people who may come forward and say, actually, this is happening? You can pass on all of the resources that we showed you on the previous slide. You can refer to the National Gambling Helpline. What you don't need to be is a gambling expert in any shape or form. We've got professionals that do that. But if you just know how you can help and support through to that free phone number, that's a great intervention for somebody who might need it. Or alternatively, you can contact Gracia or myself. We're happy to do full training sessions, and we're also happy to give you help and support if you're dealing with a client or a service user that needs it. What happens in treatment? Just briefly, you make that telephone call to the National Gambling Helpline, or alternatively on the screen there, you can see on our website, you can click through to find your nearest support centre, because I know that there are many of you on the call today from different areas of the country. Your client will be contacted within 1 to 2 working days, which I think is a phenomenal turnaround. I've worked in homelessness myself, and I know that often when I've referred through to support services, it's taken a lot longer. And we're looking at an assessment within usually 9 days, dependent on the client or the service user's availability. Appointments can be face-to-face, telephone or online, depending on what the client will, look for. And then obviously that care package will be put together, and clients will be offered ongoing appointments and regular reviews, even if they've been discharged from the formal treatment service. We are aware that obviously with all addictions, there's obviously relapse, and there's a really strong relapse loop in regards to GamCare and the treatment and the help and support that's available. As we say, if you can remember one thing from this very short presentation today, it's the National Gambling Helpline. That's free phone number, and obviously there's live chat available on our GamCare website as well. You can see both Gracia and my contact details, and we'll pop them in the chat after the presentation as well. And we'd be more than happy to obviously provide something that's a bit more of a lengthier and in-depth training session for anybody should you require it, for staff and volunteers. And thank you so much for having us today. We really appreciate that, and we hope that the information that we've sent you and we've gone through helps you.